Um, for future use, you will be getting a reminder early on Monday mornings, not right before, so that will help. But otherwise, you can use the same link every week, and that will also help. So if you save the link, you'll always be able to just click on the link and attend. And thank you to our presenters, Claire Day and Kim Coelho. Claire is the Chief Program Officer for the Alzheimer's Association of Northern California and the Northern Nevada chapter. I'll get it out. Ms. Day is a clinical social worker and received her degree from Bloomsburg University in 1993. Prior to joining the Alzheimer's Association, she worked in the long-term care field as a patient and family advocate. Kim holds a BA in journalism from HSU and a master's in science and community health from Austin Peay State University. She worked for the American Cancer Society for 15 years as a health educator and fundraiser. She now works for the Alzheimer's Association as a community engagement manager. Welcome to you both. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Jane. And I think I'm going to kick it off. And let me just share my slides here. We're so grateful to once again be able to bring you a little bit of an update, a little review and a little update on the state of where things sit for the field of Alzheimer's and dementia research across the globe. So as I think you may know, some of you might have attended this program in the past. The Alzheimer's Association is a worldwide voluntary health organization dedicated to Alzheimer's care support and research. And really what we're focused on is not just effective treatments and the end of Alzheimer's, but also looking at what and how we can maximize quality care, especially when we look at health systems, when we look at early detection and diagnosis. And you'll see some of those themes come through in some recent updates that we've received on research when it comes to early detection and diagnosis. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. A little bit about early detection, a little bit on the latest in Alzheimer's and dementia science, as well as some things that we know today about existing treatments, future treatments, and those ever important lifestyle interventions, which of course you all know you're participating in a huge one of that sort of cognitive benefit by being at an educational class today, and all of those other classes that we talked about in the beginning of the program. So keep those up. So I do always like to do a little level setting, of course, to understand the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia. We hear those words being used interchangeably. They're really different. It's important to understand the difference. And we really look at dementia as a syndrome. It's a collection of symptoms related to that cognitive decline. So I love the little umbrella. If you think of dementia as the umbrella term used to describe those symptoms, underneath the umbrella, you see all the different types of dementia. They're all caused by different biological changes in the brain, but they're all causing cognitive impairment. So I sometimes like to think of that umbrella as that top word, dementia, saying flowers. Then underneath, you'd see tulips and roses and petunias and carnations, all different types of flowers. That's how dementia is. So really, dementia are those symptoms. They're caused by whatever is causing those biological changes in the brain, which differs depending on whether or not you have Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia, etc. Now, just last week on Wednesday was the release of our annual 2023 Facts and Figures report. Just a few of these updated facts to share with you. More than 6 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's. Over 11 million are providing what we call that unpaid care, those family caregivers for people with Alzheimer's or dementia. That would equate to $18 billion 18 billion hours worth of time that would be valued at about $340 billion if someone was paying for that care that's provided by amazing caregivers across the country. And a new statistic came out this year that really looked at the lifetime risk for Alzheimer's at the age of 45. 1 in 5 over the age of women, and 1 in 10 over 45 for men. We've looked recently at a lot of these sort of emerging science that's coming out to help us understand. We know there are more women than men that have Alzheimer's disease, and we've sort of assumed for some time that age it might be the biggest reason why. We know that 2/3 of people living with Alzheimer's disease are women, and that's oftentimes we think because we live longer, right? 1 in 8 over the age of 65 will develop Alzheimer's, 1 in 3 over the age of 85. And if women are living longer, then the chances of them developing Alzheimer's might be higher. But it also might not quite be so simple. And there's a lot of research that's looking at women and hormones and menstrual cycles, pregnancy, all of those things to see whether or not that has an impact. And in fact, some early research is showing us that some of those things actually do have an impact on a woman's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, which could come into play when we look at that 1 in 5 versus 1 in 10. We also saw that, again, Alzheimer's disease deaths have increased over the last 20 years, while other key drivers of causes of death in the country have decreased by 7.3%. Heart disease in particular. Deaths from Alzheimer's have increased by 145%. And so the time really is now to think about effective treatments, to think about ways that we can reduce our risk of cognitive decline. And that's really helped us to sort of understand a little bit differently about how we look at Alzheimer's disease and thinking of it sort of on this continuum. When we talk about it, it means being on a continuum. That means those changes are happening every time, over time. Everyone will start out over here in this green where we call asymptomatic, right? Where we're cognitively intact, and that we have no cognitive symptoms. But as time progresses, if people start to develop cognitive symptoms, the early stages of these cognitive symptoms are often due to mild cognitive impairment. Now, mild cognitive impairment is clinically able to be seen on a test where they would test for memory. However, it's not impacting a person's daily life. They're still able to be very independent, live independently, do all of their things that they would normally do, but they can see some of the cognitive abilities being impacted. If someone is to continue on a cognitive loss continuum, then they would potentially develop dementia due to Alzheimer's in this sort of mild, moderate, and severe stage. Now, what we've learned over the years is that everybody that ends up with dementia due to Alzheimer's disease or another type of dementia will pass through mild cognitive impairment, but not everybody who has mild cognitive impairment goes on to develop dementia. That's important to note when we start to think about how can we reduce risks. So if we can reduce the number of cases of mild cognitive impairment, we can reduce cases of dementia. And there's some studies that have come out that really helped us to illustrate how we can have that impact on this sort of yellow stage. So years ago, we used to think that mild cognitive impairment was its own thing that just put you in an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And that is true. But what we really know now is that when someone has Alzheimer's disease, it really starts out as what we call mild cognitive impairment. And those are those early signs of cognitive loss. So when we start to look a little bit under the microscope of that, the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease in particular, you can see here there's some very significant differences between the right side of our brain image here and the left side. You can see that atrophy, that shrinking of the brain in an advanced Alzheimer's brain. You can see large gaps here in the center that you don't see on the healthy side of the brain. So this just goes to illustrate that biological, that physical change that's happening to the brain. We've long said Alzheimer's disease is not a normal part of aging. It's not normal for us to forget how to do some of these basic daily life types of tasks. What causes it in Alzheimer's in particular, it is the most common type of dementia, is this buildup of beta amyloid and these neurofibrillary tangles. These have long been known as the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease that Dr. Alois Alzheimer saw under a microscope back in 1905. What the beta amyloid does is it sort of deposits in the brain and causes those cells to stop working. The neurofibrillary tangles are caused with a different type of a protein, this tau protein that is a transport system throughout your brain that essentially gets knocked off of its tracks and for some reason tangles outside of where it's supposed to be. It's both of these pieces of biology that seem to be contributing to the loss of that cell death in really important areas of our brain that are important for memory, for thinking, and for our behavior. And so when we think about who might actually be at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, we're also learning more about what may impact our individual, as well as thinking of that at even a population level. So just a little level setting there before we sort of get into some of the science. And what we know about risk today is this into sort of two different types of categories. We have what we call these non-modifiable risks. These are those things that we can't change. Before we got started, we were talking about skiing, and my recollection of the first type of a ski lift might have been a little bit different than someone else's. And Kim politely reminded me it's because I'm a little bit younger, maybe, than someone else on the call. And so, but we're all aging every day. We're all getting older every day, whether we feel young at heart or not. We can't change that. And our brains are going to age the way the rest of us ages. If your knees don't feel as good as they used to a few years ago, our brain is the same way. But like I mentioned earlier, there is that distinct difference between normal aging, where we've all walked into a room and forgotten why we've walked in there, and age and memory loss that comes from Alzheimer's disease. So there is distinct differences there, and the two should not be confused. It is perfectly normal for us to not recall names as much as as easily as we used to be able to, but we also know that there are distinct differences between that and Alzheimer's disease. But with that said, age is a risk factor, and so the older we get, the more likely we are to develop Alzheimer's disease. We also know that genetics plays a role in our impact for risk of cognitive decline. Now, it's also important to know that there's a lot we don't know about genetics. We know that there are some genes, like the APOE4 gene, that puts us at higher risk. You can either have 0, 1, or 2 copies of that gene. And so if you have 0, 1, or 2, your copies, your risks increase based on that. However, it's just risks. It's not inevitability. And there are people that have 0 copies of the APOE4 gene who developed Alzheimer's disease, and people who do have 1 or even 2 copies of it who never showed any cognitive decline. So what we're learning about genetics is it plays less of a risk than some of these other things like sex and gender, race and ethnicity, and age, where it's really only responsible for about 5% of the worldwide statistics of people living with Alzheimer's are in this genetic component. Race and ethnicity certainly put us at higher risk. If you are African American, you are twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's. If you're Latino, you are 1.5 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's. And we're not sure why that is either. There's a lot of research being done to look at that. And then, of course, we talked about women being at higher risk than men, and certainly has more to do with just living longer. But then there's this side of this circle that really talks about those modifiable risks, those things that we can all be doing today that could decrease our risk of developing cognitive decline. And there's a lot of studies going on that support that on this side. Things like education, traumatic brain injury, physical activity, our cardiovascular health, what's good for the heart is good for the brain. The amount of sleep we get and the quality of that sleep. So we've seen studies that look at both the making sure that you're getting enough sleep, more than 7 hours of sleep, not too much sleep, so less than 9 or 10 hours of sleep. But then there's also been studies that have looked at sleep apnea and how having sleep apnea, which is very treatable, could put you at an increased risk of developing dementia. So certainly things that we should be looking at, and things that frankly are being studied at all angles. It's really important for us to see how these also work together, as well as how they could be impacted or enhanced with a future treatment down the road. It has been long the thought that an eventual treatment will most likely combine not just potential medication, but also this combination of healthy lifestyle, similar to what we've seen with heart disease and with diabetes. To give you a landscape of what's being studied right now, funded by the Alzheimer's Association, over $310 million has been awarded to over 950 projects in 48 countries. And that's just the parts that the Alzheimer's Association funds. That goes in tandem with the amazing work that's being done through the National Institute on Health to fund Alzheimer's at a higher rate than it's ever been funded before. And you can see here in 2023, $3.7 billion annually. Those of you that have been around and worked in the field for some time know that if we were to extend this bar graph back to the early 2000s, that this marker right here, this 2013 marker, about that 450,000 mark, 450 million mark would be where we had seen NIH funded research for Alzheimer's for decades, no increase. And then in 2011, we passed the National Alzheimer's Project Act, which for the first time created a nationwide plan to address Alzheimer's disease. And of course, we've steadily been able to see an increase each year to where we now sit at $3.7 billion annually. So these would be projects that would be funded by the National Institute on Health that sort of go to expand Alzheimer's and dementia research just in the US. And part of that research has really been what's helped us to find some breakthroughs in not just treatment, but also in how we think about early detection and diagnosis. So we've known for some time that an early diagnosis can have an emotional, social, and medical benefits, but we've had a couple of studies that have really helped us to identify how that happens. And really, we hear this a lot. The question always becomes, well, if there's no real medication I could take, what's the point of me getting diagnosed? You can see here, there's lots of good bullets as to why early detection matters. Not only does it help you understand your symptoms and think about what treatment options may be available for you, there has been some evidence to show that an accurate diagnosis improves health outcomes, can prevent complications, helps you access care, and it also ensures that you're making your own legal and financial decisions. You're putting into place your care plan for how you would like to be cared for throughout your disease. And one of the ways that we're seeing really an improvement in early detection and diagnosis, because for some time and even today, about 50% of people living with Alzheimer's have never been formally diagnosed by their healthcare professionals. Part of that is because people don't see the signs or they ignore the signs. Part of it is that it does take a long time right now to get a full diagnosis. And if you're not in an area where you have access to a memory center that could do a comprehensive workup, you often get either underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed. But the exciting news is that biomarker technologies are really changing the game for the field and the research, moving at a really remarkable pace. These tools will change our experience in the physician's office in many ways in the future, but they're already playing a critical part of how we conduct clinical research studies today, and they're certainly changing the research and clinical landscape. So over the past few years, we've seen an enormous amount of research focused on developing new biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease and other dementia. When we talk about what a biomarker is, you may be familiar with the term, you may not, but essentially a biomarker is a part of you. It's a biological piece of you that can show evidence of a disease. So probably one of the most common ways people think about this is in regards to a blood test and, let's say, high cholesterol. You can go in for a blood test and they can test that blood and figure out whether or not you have high cholesterol. They can figure out whether or not your blood sugars are high. Those are using that piece of you, that biological piece of you, to detect a part of a disease or a type of disease in your blood. And so what we're seeing is really some emerging work in not just the blood and those blood biomarkers, but also through the advanced technology of brain imaging, which now can detect both amyloid and tau, those two hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, on a PET scan, a positron emissions tomography scan, as well as we're seeing some newer emerging markers around retinal scans, and even some more complicated work with cerebral spinal fluid and some of the DNA side of things. Now, today, these are not tests that are available in your clinical practice. You cannot get a brain image without paying for it privately. It's not covered by insurance. There is no blood test you can go to your doctor and get today in your clinical practice. But where this is really accelerating the speed of research is by ensuring that people that are now entering into clinical trials for a specific type of dementia have the biological markers of that disease. So, 20 years ago, when people would have been enrolled in a clinical study for an Alzheimer's medication that maybe targets the amyloid in the brain, there was no way to prove that that person had amyloid on their brain. They would have the same type of tests that we see today in clinical practice, which is on this right side of the screen, this history and cognition, where you get a series of tests. You would have blood tests, but it would be to rule out any type of an infection or anything else that could be causing the symptoms. They would do a history and cognition testing where they look at your past medical history. They give you those cognitive tests and make a probable diagnosis of Alzheimer's or another type of dementia based on this history and cognition. But what biomarkers would do is sort of modernize this diagnosis, right? Where even someone who might be cognitively unimpaired, because we know that 20 years or more before symptoms appear, those brain changes of Alzheimer's may begin. So if I'm going to develop Alzheimer's in my 70s, if I'm going to develop, I should say, the cognitive impairment, if I'm going to have that visible sign of cognitive impairment in my 70s, that buildup of amyloid plaque and those tau tangles are already starting to accumulate in my brain today. So not only would biomarkers be able to help with an effective, once we have an effective treatment to maybe even stop the progression, they can certainly give a clear indication of someone who is cognitively impaired and know for certain. And there's been a couple of studies that have really shown us some important information around that. One is through the use of PET scans in a trial called the IDEAS trial. So a PET scan, if you're not familiar, is a positron emissions tomography. It can aid doctors in diagnosing and treating these memory conditions by the use of both an agent that can either look at measuring the amyloid or can measure the tau. And what the IDEAS trial did, and I know this is a very busy slide, so I'm just going to sort of break it down for you, was it worked with physicians around the country and enrolled Medicare beneficiaries who didn't have a clear case diagnosis. So it was suspected that they had Alzheimer's, but it was maybe not a very clear case when it came to diagnosing. And so in this study, what physicians were able to do was to use a PET scan to tell whether or not someone actually did have Alzheimer's or not. Now, what they found in this trial was, if you look at this purple box, which I know it's a little, there's a lot of information on here, but in patients who, when they got their scan, did have amyloid, it improved the diagnostic rate. So about 15% were told that they didn't have Alzheimer's when they really did. So it improved the accuracy of the diagnostic rate from 80.3% to 95.5%. But I think this teal side is the most important part of this slide, because in this side, this looked at the people who, before the PET scan, had been given a probable diagnosis of Alzheimer's, but after they got the PET scan, only 10% of that 71.5% did actually have the presence of amyloid on their brain. And so it meant that something else was going on with them. It wasn't Alzheimer's, but oftentimes we see, because we're just using this history and cognition approach, that we're maybe not getting the diagnosis right all the time. And so what the IDEAS trials showed us was that this is improving health outcomes, because certainly you want to know for sure you have what you have. More importantly, you want to know for sure you don't have what you don't have. And so making sure that people are properly diagnosed has been the main outcome of the importance of this study. This trial was funded primarily by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They believe that an accurate diagnosis in the long run is going to not only improve health outcomes, but will also decrease costs over time, because oftentimes we find when people aren't diagnosed properly and then they're not sort of following the right protocol for care and support, it could lead to unnecessary hospital stays and other emergent medical issues that ends up costing Medicare just as much money. So we're not to the point where we have these scans approved yet by Medicare for diagnostics, but we're closer than we ever have been. And they are going to continue the IDEAS trial with new ideas where they will increase the number of diverse participants to really understand how amyloid and tau plays a role in participants of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. They're also going to look at people who are younger than the age of 65. This initial study, because it focused on Medicare beneficiaries, was all people who were obviously over the age of 65. So this is just starting out now. We don't really have any information from it, but when we have this data, I think Medicare will have an opportunity to hopefully look at this data and make some decisions about ensuring that people have access to diagnostic tools that can help to make a true diagnosis. But we also know the PET scans are expensive. They're not going to be for everybody. You have to live in a geographic area where you can have a place that has those scan machines and a lab that can process the agent that provide the agent that you have to have in order to get the PET scan. And that's where this sort of race towards a blood test really is exciting. We've seen a lot of work across the globe developing these blood-based biomarkers for Alzheimer's and other types of dementia. There's barriers to access in terms of coverage. They're also a little more invasive than something like a blood case. If you think about the PET scans, a little bit more invasive. Cerebral spinal fluid taps, very invasive, very expensive. But blood tests, we get them all the time, right? We go annually and get lab work done. And imagine if we could have a way to have a treatment for diagnosis that's just as effective as a PET scan and is something that's readily available. And again, I want to make sure it's clear, these are not available yet in our doctor's offices, but we're probably less than 5 years away from having the opportunity to see a blood test be used in an effective way in a physician's office to ensure that we get an accurate and timely diagnosis. In the meantime, what's currently happening in the field of Alzheimer's disease and treatments has been kind of an exciting few years. We've seen progress, not just in risk reduction, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but also around more effective treatments. The landscape of the FDA-approved therapies has certainly changed in the last 6 to 12 months. There are now actually 6 approved FDA categories of therapies or types of therapies that are out there. We have a number of these therapies. You'll see that 5 of them here are really in the same category, right? They're designed to treat the symptoms. They're in 2 different types of categories that treat symptoms. One are those acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. The other is called a glutamate modulator. These drugs do not slow down, modify, stop, or reverse the disease. Rather, they are treating the symptoms. And so the first to come on the market, it was technically the second. The first drug for Alzheimer's was a drug called Cognex that is no longer prescribed because, like many, the first one out of the gate is usually not always the one that's around the longest. It's the first one out, but the others that follow in its footsteps really learn and benefit from that. And that's true for this class of medications, and it's true for our new targets as well. So Aricept, Exelon, and Razidine, all designed to do the same thing, just 3 different types of the same medication. Aricept is approved for early, moderate, and late stage Alzheimer's. Exelon and Razidine are really only approved by the FDA for early to moderate stage Alzheimer's. And then in 2003, this is the glutamate modulator that came around, Namenda. And that is oftentimes used in concert with one of the 3 previous medications. So just a few years ago, well, gosh, almost 10 years ago now, doesn't 2014 seem like it was just a few years ago? They actually created 1 pill dose combining both the acetylcholinesterase inhibitor and the glutamate modulator, so that people in the later stages of the disease would only have to take 1 pill instead of 2 different pills. As we know, sometimes taking medication can be a little bit challenging. Now, in 2021, we saw the first approval of a new drug in a new category aimed at slowing down disease progression and targeting the underlying biology of the disease. This first drug is known as aducanumab or Aduhelm, and this targets those amyloid plaques and the brain that we looked at in an earlier slide. But aducanumab is one of many drugs that are targeting amyloid in the brain, similar to what we saw here, right? There's many different drugs trying to do the same thing. Earlier this year, the FDA approved its second drug that slows down disease progression by targeting that underlying biology. Leqembi, or lecanemab, is that second drug that in clinical trials showed a 28% reduction in disease and cognitive decline. And it is really changing the course for Alzheimer's disease in a meaningful way for people in the early stage of the disease. Now, what we also know, though, is that there's more on the way. So another drug that's targeting amyloid that's under FDA approved is called donanemab. But I think it's also important to see that there are also 150 unique therapies that are being tested in clinical trials, specifically looking at the biology of Alzheimer's disease. So it's really important. I call this my no stone left unturned slide. It's really important to see that while we're seeing some real progress here with targeting the amyloid, that there's so many other things that are impacting our brain that are being tested, because this isn't just going to be a one size fits all. There is lots of really great research looking at the tau protein and how that is a contributor to Alzheimer's disease. Not to mention all of the other clinical trials that are looking at different types of dementia as well, and the biology changes there. But you can see here that we're looking a lot at neuroinflammation. We're looking at neurotransmitters. We're looking at bioenergetics, all types of the way the cells communicate with each other. And some of this science really emerges at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference. It's held every July. So I have some of the recent updates from that presentation just last July. One in particular, when we talk about some emerging science, then this is a bit early, but important to just see how every day, every month, every year, we seem to be learning more and more about that underlying biology in particular, and how things like cells even have an impact on how the biology of Alzheimer's and other types of dementia really plays out. This was a plenary session at AAIC last year that looked at something called astrocytes. Astrocytes are one of the immune cells in the brain that actually change their structure and function in two types of dementia, Alzheimer's and Huntington's disease. Now, up until this point, of Dr. Eskerten's research, they were sort of thought, these immune cells were thought to really not have any impact on neurological disease. They were considered this sort of passive bystander. They were just cells in the brain that really didn't do anything. But what this research has shown scientists that will be able to take this and use it for future studies is that these immune cells change in both the brains of people with Alzheimer's and Huntington's disease. And sometimes it's a good change and sometimes it's a bad change. And so what we're really understanding is that these immune cells might have impact on behaviors like depressive-like symptoms, like fear and anxiety, which are all behaviors, symptoms that are impacted by Alzheimer's disease. So it's really just a quick landscape to show you some of the level of science that's being studied. It's not just about creating a medication to get us across the finish line. All of this preliminary work still is evolving that shows us how much complexity there is to a brain, and how dementia is really testing that complexity. We also saw a study come out of AAIC that really talked a little bit about COVID-19. It's important to note that COVID-19, while not specifically tied to Alzheimer's disease, is being looked at by the Alzheimer's Association and the World Health Organization and many other organizations about how the impact of the virus what kind of impact it has on the brain. And certainly one of the studies in its early reportings showed us that persistent loss of smell over time as a symptom of COVID-19 is a better predictor of long-term cognitive impairment than the severity of the illness at the time of illness. They're also, again, looking at the differences between men and women, we saw that the pandemic itself had a bigger impact on cognitive symptoms in women than it did on men, especially women who were working and who had a lower socioeconomic status. They were, during that time of the pandemic, was associated with more cognitive symptoms. Now, there were some positive things that came out of the pandemic as well. And we saw a study that showed that positive life changes during the pandemic may reduce the negative impact on memory and thinking. So when we start to think about some of that risk reduction and lifestyle changes, we can see where in those early days of the pandemic, people made more of an effort to connect with people. Even if it was over the phone or on a Zoom call, they went out into their neighborhoods and walked. And so you could see where some of those positive life changes also bubbled up in some of this COVID-19 research. But I think it just goes to show, when you think about that persistent loss of smell, how that inflammatory response, thinking of how inflammation really is a big area of focus. We can't just focus on amyloid. We can't just focus on tau, that we have to look at all of these things and how they're interrelated within the brain. And a lot of our research over the last few years has focused on that big word of risk reduction. What we know about Alzheimer's today is what's happening in the brain. What we don't know is the why. And so until we get to that point, the need for us to do everything and anything we can today is really important. So we know that up to 40% of dementia cases could be prevented or delayed by targeting some of these risk factors. And it's all the fun stuff that we've been hearing about for years: physical health, diet, cognitive and social stimulation. But there were a couple of studies that came out of AAIC this year that really kind of solidified that foundation for me. This first one was on the use of, or the consumption, I should say, of ultra-processed foods and dementia risk. Now, we've known for many years we are what we eat, right? That's what we've always been told. But what we eat may also actually change the brain. And what this study looked at was consuming more than 20% of your daily caloric intake in ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods are those things that are high in calories, low in protein, low in fiber. They have a lot of sugar, probably a lot of ingredients that you can't pronounce or consider to be those ultra-processed foods. But it's that ratio of calories versus fiber and protein. People who consumed more than 20% of their daily caloric intake in these forms of these foods were associated with a 28% faster decline in global cognitive scores. That's a little bit troubling. And so that's certainly an easy change that people can make to decrease their risk. We want people to sort of think about the foods that they're putting in their bodies. When you think about the things that could be an incorporated healthy action. But another study that came out of AAIC looked at the physical activity, and this one was really exciting because this looked at people who had that mild cognitive impairment. Now think back to that original slide that had the continuum of memory loss, of cognitive loss on it. We know that mild cognitive impairment is that sort of first stage, if you would, if you're going to go on to develop Alzheimer's disease. Again, not everybody who develops mild cognitive impairment goes on to develop Alzheimer's disease, but if you do, you're in that mild cognitive impairment first. So this study was looked at two arms of an intervention. People were either randomized into an aerobic arm or a stretching and strength training arm. So these are people who had mild cognitive impairment and they both exercised. Their exercise was just different. It's been long thought that aerobic exercise seems to have the best, not only cardiovascular, but potentially brain health potential at reducing risk. What this study showed us was that Both the aerobic intervention and the stretching arm showed no cognitive decline after 12 months. So these are people with mild cognitive impairment, and both were doing exercise, just a little bit different type. This is really exciting because it shows that both regular aerobic exercise or stretching and balance may still stall cognitive decline. These are people who were sedentary. So these aren't marathon runners who were involved in this trial. But when you think about people who might not physically be able to do 30 to 40 minutes of aerobic exercise 3 or 4 times a week, it means that there is still some potential benefit from doing these stretching and balance exercises that could help to keep your cognitive functioning as high as it could be. So I really like that one because we're using the aerobic exercise in the US Pointer study, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And I can tell you that participants in Pointer, injuries happen, things happen, and so you're not always able to continue with that aerobic exercise at the same pace. And knowing that this stretching arm may have as much benefit is, I think, really encouraging as well, because it gives people options. So another thing that we need to look at is, of course, that cardiovascular health, and certainly looking at our blood pressure is a big way that we do that. The Sprint Mind study was the first study to demonstrate a reduction of new cases of cognitive impairment by managing that systolic level of our blood pressure. We know that in this trial, 9,000 people were randomized into 2 arms, either the standard blood pressure intervention, where they had kept their systolic at 140 systolic, versus that intensive treatment where they lowered that systolic to about 120. And we saw in the people in the 120 arm, a 19% reduced risk for MCI, a 17% reduced risk for dementia. And when they looked at both together, it was a 15% reduced risk of both mild cognitive impairment and dementia. Now we're going to look at that even longer. The Alzheimer's Association and the National Institute on Health has funded a follow-up study called Sprint Mind 2.0 to really clarify that impact. We've got to look over time to be able to see that, because dementia is a slower progression, right? You don't go from being cognitively normal to cognitively impacted overnight unless there's been some sort of medical issue. It would be over time that they would need to look at that. So monitoring blood pressure is a big part also of the US Pointer study, which if you've attended the program before, you might have heard me talk about. What's really exciting about this is we have now finished recruitment. The slides, I just noticed, is a little outdated, which, considering this started right before March of 2019, is when we first started the study. It's really exciting to see that we've finally hit those recruitment numbers. The US Pointer study is going to test all of these lifestyle changes together: exercise, nutrition, cognitive and social engagement, as well as the health coaching. So looking at your blood sugars, looking and managing your blood pressure, thinking about cholesterol levels, and what happens in people who are older adults who are sedentary, who are at risk for cognitive decline. If we start to make some of these lifestyle changes, will there be an impact on decreasing our risk for dementia? If these interventions prove effective, the study will lead to the development of accessible and sustainable community-based programs for prevention, which is really exciting to think about. And of course, modeled off of something called the FINGER trial, which started in Finland. And you can see here the world is looking at these types of lifestyle interventions, because it is going to be a combination. It will not be just one or the other. It's not going to be one medication that solves this problem. Our brains are just too complex for that to be the answer. We saw that from looking at cells. We saw that from looking at those lifestyle impacts, age, everything combined makes this a really complicated puzzle to put together. And so it's really exciting to see how we're seeing all these pieces of science come together. We know that we learn something new with every study that we do, even the ones that don't meet their endpoints. Something is taken out of that can help a future scientist solve this problem. And it is exciting to see the variation in the types of trials that are happening today. You can see here, while the most are for Alzheimer's disease, we do see a number of trials looking at related dementias, vascular dementia, and mild cognitive impairment, which it wasn't until recently that we made that connection that if you are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, you have at one point passed through mild cognitive impairment. So understanding mild cognitive impairment more is really, really important, because what that helps us to look at is the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease. And like I mentioned, that future will probably be a powerful combination of effective medicines and risk reduction strategies, because if we can do that by 2025, and we can delay the onset of Alzheimer's by just 5 years, 5.7 million people expected to develop Alzheimer's in 2050 would not, which is huge. It's a huge number. When you think of the cost of care, the impact on caregivers, the impact on our health system, it's really why we always say the time is now. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Wait, let me just go one more slide to give you some information on our website at alz.org, as well as our 800 number, 800-272-3900. But I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to throw it over to my wonderful colleague, Kim Coelho, who's going to take it from here.
Thank you, Claire. We're so lucky to have you. So it's wonderful that she can come do this for us. Kim Laney's going to share my slide. All right, so I'm here, just a brief little thing about the Walk to End Alzheimer's. So it is the world's largest event to raise awareness and funds for Alzheimer's care, support, and research. It's held annually in over 600 communities nationwide. This inspiring event calls on participants of all ages and abilities to reclaim the future for millions. And you can see those are pictures from our local walk. Folks in the Adorni Center holding up their flowers during the opening ceremony. And then we have the CEO of Providence there cutting the ribbon at the opening, the marching lumberjacks in the background. So Walked into Alzheimer's, it unites the entire community, family, friends, coworkers, social, religious groups, and more. While there's no fee to participate, to register at all, each participant is encouraged to fundraise in order to contribute to the cause and to help raise awareness. So dollars raised at this event fuel our mission-related initiative of care, support, and research. And so last year, over the 600 walks that were held, over 320,000 people participated, and I think it was 90-something million raised. So in Humboldt County, so last year we had 481 folks participate. It was the first year after 2 years that we could actually meet in person, which was, we were thrilled to be able to be back in person and not just walking from home. So we had 47 teams. We raised 153,000 altogether. Visiting Angels is a wonderful team. They're a top team locally and nationwide. And then our 8th annual event, do you want to go to the next slide? So our 8th annual event will be held on Saturday, October 14th at the Adorni Center. Registration begins at 9, opening ceremonies at 10. We walk at 10:30, closing ceremony at 11:15. Distances are 1 mile and 3 mile. Everybody takes off together for the first mile. And then if you want to keep going for the 3rd mile, you can. It's a quick event. It means so much to folks living with the disease that show up at the event and their family, to see folks from Humboldt County showing up and saying, hey, this is important to us. So it means a lot. There's a lot of stigma still with the disease. So to see this huge group of people that care about this event. If you'd like to get involved, you can join the planning committee. We have different committees. We meet once a month for an hour. So it's not a huge time commitment, but you can be involved more or less. You can start or join a team. So super easy. You recruit your friends, family, colleagues, free registration, unlimited team size. We have some teams that have 1, we have some teams that have 100. So it's up to you. You can text ALZ Walk to the number there, or alz.org//Humboldt in order to find the website. We have sponsorship opportunities if you have businesses that might be interested. We always need a ton of volunteers at the event. We set up on Friday, and then on walk day, we need folks to help out. And then if you have questions, my contact information is below there. All right, back to you, Claire, for questions.
Yeah, thank you. And I saw the first one about the blood test, so I'll sort of give a little bit more detail about the blood test. I was actually just trying to find the second answer was about or the second question, I should say, was about the EXERT trial. And I'm not sure exactly how much of the strength and balance training. I know that the aerobic exercise was like using a treadmill, and I'm not sure that that's actually published yet. So I was quickly trying to see from Dr. Baker as to whether or not Dr. Baker is the principal investigator. So I'll do a little research on that, and Jane, I can forward that to you on the EXERT trial. But the blood tests, we've seen research on newer types of markers, like a marker called alpha-synuclein, which would be indicative of Lewy body dementia. And then even neurofilament light, which is an indicator of whether or not the brain will be damaged due to, not specific to one type of dementia. So there's lots of, like, the biomarkers themselves, like I'm not really an expert on what the specific thing in the blood is that tells them the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia. But I think what the important takeaway is that a couple of things. One is, no, they're not available today in your doctor's office, but hopefully within the next, like I said, 3 to 5 years, they should be. What they found is that there's enough evidence to show that these, whatever the actual biology is that they find in the blood, there's enough evidence to show that its efficacy. The next piece is making sure that they set the parameters for how that blood gets drawn, how it gets stored, what temperature it gets stored at, so that the results are consistent. And I think it's one of those things where you never thought about, like, is it, what kind of a cylinder is it? Is it kept in a vial? Is it kept in at room temperature? Like, how and where they store the blood is sort of where they get to now to make that test then available in your doctor's office in the next few years. So I think that's answered the blood test one. Yeah, so, and I think to Elaine's question, I think that second part of my question, my answer hopefully got it. So they have enough evidence to show that it works. What they have to do now is figure out how to get that into your doctor's office. That's sort of a big part of how to then get that into the doctor's office. And then, yeah, stretching and balance would be things like yoga, Pilates, just even muscle strength, strength training, as well as stretching. And I'm sure that they had some freedom on, if it's anything like US Pointer, they could kind of create their own types of strength and balance training. I don't know how often that they had to do it. I can tell you that for US Pointer, it's 30 to 40 minutes, 4 to 5 times a week. My guess would be it would be similar to that, but I will see if I can get that answer for you, Jane. Then the next question is around the Medicare, the annual wellness tests for mild cognitive decline. Okay. So I'm just trying to read these at the same time. So your Medicare wellness test should contain a cognitive screening, right? Where they do some, and I see a couple of people shaking their heads. So does that mean you've had that experience, right? Where they will ask you some of those memory questions. Consistently, it's not always done. There are some physicians who skip over that part, and there are some who do those part. I think I'm not quite sure the question there, but I think what we're getting to when we think about having effective treatments, having effective tests to be able to use those treatments, is getting to that point where we do routinely have like a baseline of memory, which today we don't, right? So if you needed a baseline of your memory, it would have had to be done in sort of our 40s and 50s. And we're not doing that because there's no treatments. But if we have a treatment that could stop the progression of the disease before any of the symptoms occur, that's when I think we'll get to a future of sort of having those baseline screenings much broader than probably what happens now, which is probably a few simple tests to test your short-term memory, maybe ask you if you have any memory complaints. I'm not sure what the Medicare screening for cognitive is doing, but that should be something that you routinely do at your Medicare wellness visit. I'd be curious, either by just nodding of heads or even people using the chat, if they're doing their or if you're doing an annual Medicare wellness visit. Are most people doing that, or are most people not doing that? Okay. I'm happily seeing shaking heads. That's good.
The issue is what happens with the results.
Sure.
I mean, they do the test and you decide whether you remembered 2 or 5 out of the 5 questions when you have all these intervening things, etc. But what do they do with the results? Are there guidelines as to what doctors should do with those results? Should they have a little talk with you if you're declining? Are there medical guidelines to that effect? And should doctors be referring you to some kind of discussion somewhere with someone?
Yeah, and I would say that there are guidelines. I think whether or not primary care physicians have access or know where to find those guidelines is probably the bigger question. And one of the things that recently happened in California was the creation of something called Dementia Care Aware, which is funded by the state of California through the leadership of Dr. Anna Chodos at UCSF. And what Dementia Care Aware is doing is exactly that, Jane, is giving an opportunity for primary care physicians to have access to validated screening tools, to know how to use those tools, and most importantly, to know what to say to the patient after they have a negative or positive result, and really kind of help them through sort of delivering that diagnosis, because we find, like I mentioned earlier, about 50% of people living with dementia have never been formally diagnosed. And that's not because it's for a lot of different reasons, but part of it is that physicians have said they don't feel comfortable delivering a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. They either don't know that they have the skills to do it or don't know how to have the conversation. In our facts and figures report this year, we focused on looking at both a patient and physician feedback on understanding diagnosis, understanding treatment, because I think physicians are willingly saying, I don't feel comfortable doing this. And so Dementia Care Aware is helping to answer that. So if you think your physician would be interested in that, we can help get them. It's free. It's and there's a website. I think it's just Dementia Care Aware. Actually, I don't know what the actual website is. I can probably find it. Because I do think that we're at a turning point with the FDA approval of a treatment. We're at a turning point of making sure that physicians really understand what those treatments are aimed to do. And the key to lecanemab is the truliest earliest point of cognitive loss, because people in the sort of later early stage are not going to benefit from this medication. They're not going to be clinically appropriate for it. And so the success of this medication was with those who it was caught at the earliest point of intervention, which means that early detection is huge. So yes, that's the, that would be, let me put, I think I just found, why does it always do that? I just found the website. It is just dementiacareaware.org. And I'll put that in there. And then someone asked, loss of smell, further info available. So that was specific, that particular study was specific to COVID-19. If you'd had a persistent loss of smell from COVID-19, not necessarily related to Alzheimer's, but some sort of cognitive decline. It's in very early stages, so we don't have a lot of information about that. But I think inflammation, when we look at the inflammatory response, that is being studied in Alzheimer's as well. There may be some connection there, but I don't really have a lot of information on that.
Is there any way to do anything to regain your sense of smell when this kind of thing happens?
I'm not sure that I would know what that is, Kim. I don't know if you've heard anything about loss of smell and how to. I don't know that I've heard.
Yeah, I have, unfortunately. Rowetta had a question. So she said she signed up for brain research, sent a couple tests, took a while to understand, haven't heard back. Was it through Trial Match, Rowetta? You're on mute.
I believe it was the same one that you're on, but I'm not sure what it was.
Okay. And with Trial Match, I know I usually every 3 months I'll get a new.
Oh, I haven't had anything. Yeah.
Okay. And it's been longer than 3 months. Do you have should she re-enroll, Claire, or?
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah, because I don't know that I would be able to have access to see whether or not you're still in there. So maybe we could send the Trial Match link. And it might just be that there isn't anything that's matched to you. Or it might be that maybe you just need to update something in your profile.
Okay. I would appreciate you sending that.
Do we have your contact information, Kim? Do we have?
I do, yes. So
Okay,
I
great.
can send that to you, Rowetta.
Great.
So when
Thank
we're
you,
done
Kim.
here, definitely.
And then I know that because I'm losing the chat here, but I know someone asked about cognitive training and those cognitive tests and whether or not there's any benefit for them. I mean, I think that's part of what we're trying to singularly, there has been some evidence to show that there is some benefit to those cognitive tests. And I think what is important to know about cognitive training is two things. One is it has to be something that you enjoy. Otherwise, I guarantee you will not continue to do it. And two, it has to challenge you. So if you get to a point where you've achieved a certain level or you're getting comfortable in a certain level, it's time to move it up to the next level and really challenge your brain. The most benefit from some of those cognitive brain training type programs is that you're learning something new. Now, you don't have to do those brain programs either. You can do lots of other things like learning a new language or taking a music class or anything that's really challenging your brain to learn something new can give you some good benefit. Will it prevent you from getting Alzheimer's disease? We can't say that today. Will it decrease your risk? Absolutely. I think the more we do that whole use it or lose it mentality really rings true when it comes to those brain trainings. And again, it could be reading a book. It could be something that you're doing that's, really engaging. I would say probably not watching, Dancing with the Stars or The Bachelor, but something maybe a little bit more engaging where you're actually learning something and your mind is being forced to do something that it doesn't normally do. The best thing to do for prevention, eat prunes. Prunes is a new one. I don't know that I've heard about prunes. Exercise, puzzles, socialization, drink red wine. That holds true. I'm not sure about prunes. I'm going to have to write down that one. I don't know that I've heard specifically about prunes, but what I can tell you is all of the things that you mentioned in there is exactly what we're doing with US Pointer, right? It's exactly what Dr. Mia Chiapolta did in Finland with the finger study. Exercise, so that cardiovascular, which also for us in Pointer includes strength training and balance and stretching. Exercising our brain, the brain games or some of that, some of those new, learning something new. The Mind diet is the one that you're probably referring to that talks about red wine. Mind, MIND, seems to have the best evidence. It's sort of a combination of the Mediterranean and the DASH diet. And it looks at things like dark green leafy vegetables and omega-3 fatty acids. And certainly in the Mind diet, when it was being studied singularly, red wine was absolutely, you did not get knocked off a point for having one glass of red wine a day for all of those benefits that still seem to ring true. What I like about the Mind diet, and I meant to mention this when we talked about those ultra processed foods, is the Mind diet isn't about all or nothing. It really is a balance. It was sort of developed around this kind of point system where you want to aim for a certain number of points a day, and you get points for eating the good stuff and you don't get points for eating the bad stuff. So if you break down and have an Egg McMuffin tomorrow morning because you're just craving it and you pass McDonald's, that's okay. Because you can make it up in other ways throughout the day by eating lots of dark green leafy vegetables and making sure that your other proteins for the day are lean. The only thing that I really truly have a fundamental issue with on the Mind diet is they want you to limit your cheese intake to 2 ounces a week, which I think is absolutely inappropriate, but apparently it's got the best outcome for our brain. So that might be the one that every day I take the loss on. So it's about moderation, right? And really finding those things, but there is a lot of evidence around that Mediterranean, those heart healthy, the olive oil, all really good fuel for our brain. And I think just have had overall good impact for both cardiovascular and brain health. Now, again, changing your diet isn't going to make sure that you don't get Alzheimer's. And I think one of the things that's really hard is that I know lots of people who have done all the right things and have done everything right, and they've still developed Alzheimer's. And it's why we still need to figure out the medications and figure out how to stop the cognitive loss and think about that combination therapy, because it's not going to just be able to be staved off by diet and exercise. If it were that simple, it would not be great, but it's just not, unfortunately. But I will look into prunes. I didn't know about prunes.
And then Jane had a question, if there's any local PET scans that are available, and I'm not sure, you said spec scans. Not that I'm aware of, Jane. I think we do have to go to UCSF. And what do they cost? Do you know what the cost is?
Yeah, which is exactly why I bring up about PET scans can't be the answer for diagnosis either, because when you look at most of the United States, they're not going to be living within a 20 to 30 mile radius of an institution that's going to have access. So that's where the blood test is great. They cost out of pocket, I would say somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000 if you wanted to have a brain PET scan. And again, we're trying to get that. I think the IDEA study is helping us to show that there's evidence to have that covered by insurance, because it should be.
Definitely. And then Jane, you said, what about the Daniel Amen Clinic? I'm not familiar with them.
He's on PBS with some frequency.
Ah,
He started the original PET scans, basically,
Oh,
for
okay.
diagnosis, because he's a psychiatrist, and he said it's amazing that if you're in psychiatry that you don't look at the physiological manifestations of the problem. So he has clinics all over the United States, and he does PBS programs, and they just had one on the most recent key fundraiser that you can obtain. And I would recommend everybody take a look at it, because he goes through a lot of things related to keeping a healthy brain. And I would strongly recommend that you guys look into that, because he's been doing this for decades. He was one of the innovators in the whole area of PET scans, and he calls them SPEC scans, but that's all right. Same idea. And he can evaluate both blood flow and activity levels. So it's great. If you want to go to Keat, they had their fundraiser starting, was ended last week, but you can still go online and find that program and obtain it. And it's very, very worthwhile. And we had another question. Joanne said something about, I went to a seminar in LA for Alzheimer's years ago, because anyway, that was the Crohn's.
That was
Crohn's has something to do with maintaining your digestive system.
I was going to say, I was going to say exactly that. So there is a lot of studies. In fact, one of the ancillary studies for US Pointer is this sort of idea of good gut health. And I could see how Crohn's could be recommended as part of that, because I think this whole idea of really making of understanding how the microbiomes and your gut health have some sort of connection. I don't know that there's enough research yet to show it, but there's enough to say that, we're doing this ancillary study. So people that enroll in Pointer have the option to then participate in an additional study that will look at either their vascular system, their sleep patterns, their gut health, and there's another one I'm blanking.
Lymphatic system.
No, I'm forgetting. It's neurovascular.
Neurovascular,
yeah. So there's a I'm blanking on the fourth one, but because again, I don't think any of these things live in silos, and I think that's one of the challenges, is that we have to look at the whole when it comes to the brain, because I think it has an impact on everything.
How could you put something in the chat about the Pointer, or how do you get access to the Pointer?
Yeah, so US Pointer, I can certainly send you the email or the website so that you can keep updated on it. Recruitment has ended, and you did have to live within, we were, Northern California is one of 5 sites across the US, and it was in the greater Sacramento area. But enrollment has closed, but if you're interested in learning a little bit about it, and certainly seeing any of the results as we start to, the time will tick now for 2 years till we end the trial. It's been a really great lesson in really understanding how these clinical trials takes so much time. So there's the recruitment period, there's the time of bringing people onto the study, and whatever the study is, you have to, while people might be in the study for 2 whole years, recruitment didn't end until last week. And so then we'll go another 2 years, and it's understandable why it takes so long for these clinical trials to show any sort of results. But the hope will be that we can show the evidence to at least give something to people as far as what we should all be doing to maintain our brain health and do anything we can to decrease our risks.
And
Are there any other questions?
there was one other one, Jane, in here. Does loss of taste from COVID-19 affect dementia? I'm not sure if we answered that yet, or if we know that.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything about the early studies with taste. Just the loss of smell, the persistent loss of smell has been one. That's not to say that taste doesn't have some impact, but I think the studies around COVID-19, as you can imagine, are very early. And so we don't have a lot of data yet, but there is a lot of research going on to really understand how the virus impacts our brains.
Do you have any information about how sleep apnea affects the brain?
Yeah, so I'm going to do my best to remember. The studies for sleep apnea are a few years old, but there was a definite correlation between having sleep apnea and your increased risk of dementia, and they've similarly looked at just overall sleep health. And so, I would encourage you all to, if you want to Google, they call it sleep hygiene. It's essentially, the things that you're supposed to do in preparation for getting a good night's sleep. And as you can imagine, it's all the obvious things, right? Like not having caffeine after a certain time of day, and thinking about things like sugar, things that are stimulants that could stop you from falling asleep. But then it's, the blue screen and taking away from your phone and, your iPad. And that can be a challenge for people, right? Because a lot of people use these devices now to read books instead of like having a paper book. I still like paper books, but I think I'm one of the few people that likes those still. But the screen time really, right before you fall asleep, is supposed to not be good for you. And certainly falling asleep with the TV on or the iPad on are supposed to be not good. Jane, I'll have to find my old slides to get you the results. I can't remember the sleep apnea.
We did a program on lifestyle changes that had half of it on sleep hygiene, that you can go to the fall program and look into the end of November.
Yeah.
There's
And
a
if
whole
you know
program
you
on
have
that.
sleep apnea, you should absolutely get it treated.
Yeah,
It's a hard one to treat, though, I know, because it's very invasive.
it's obnoxious, but it's worth it.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't know I had it, and found out I had it when we did a sleep study. And it's taken me months to get acclimated, because you have to figure out the right kind of device, the right kind of headset, the right kind of mask. And it's like you go through these various stages, and months later, it's finally working. But I started in October.
Yeah.
The beginning of October.
Wow.
Yeah.
So but it does work. And when you make it work, it makes a difference. You feel awake during the day.
Yeah, that's interesting. You
But
could tell a difference.
It's increasing oxygenation to the brain.
But you could tell the difference.
You can tell. You can
Wow,
tell.
that's great.
Wow.
And
That's great.
and if you have sleep apnea and it's untreated, you can get AFib, atrial
Yeah.
fibrillation, which is a heart problem. You're not, again, it means you're not getting enough blood flow and enough oxygen through your body into the brain. So it's important to find out, listen for your partner or your kids or whatever, whoever, if they are not breathing regularly, like 10 to 16 breaths a minute, check it out.
And Jane, someone asked, what's the name of the OLLI class that dealt with sleep?
Lifestyle changes Sharon and I did it. I did the one on sleep. There are 48 slides on it. You'll be sorry. But I wrote it all out on the slides as well as presenting it. So
Really good and so important. So boy, get a good
Yeah,
night's sleep.
absolutely.
Makes or breaks your day. So
Yeah.
anyway, any other questions? Have we worn you out? I really
Wow.
appreciate you doing this again. And
Always
thank
happy
you
to be
ever
with
so
you.
much. It's invaluable, and the more we can learn, and the more we can learn how we can recognize it, and when it's just aging, a little mental forgetfulness versus, actually mild cognitive impairment. I think that's the stage at which we really need to be able to do something and then know what to do when we think it's happening, and who to go to when we think that's happening. And that's not at all obvious.
And I would just say, thank you first of all, thank you for letting us come. But I think we need to just acknowledge that we need to normalize Alzheimer's and dementia. There's nothing that anyone's doing that's causing this. We know we can put ourselves at greater risk, but you can put yourself at greater risk for anything. I think we need to normalize cognitive impairment and cognitive loss as just being what it is, which is a disease, and we need to be okay with getting a diagnosis and talking about it and finding ways to make it better. So thank you for allowing us to come in and do what we do, because we just want to be there to help people. So thank you for giving us that opportunity.
Well, we really appreciate it. So thank you ever so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you, I suspect, again in the future, maybe in early fall before your next Alzheimer's walk, because will you have another conference before the fall, before October?
So July will be the next one.
Well, maybe we should schedule for sometime in September to get updates.
Yeah, maybe just the updates from the
Yeah,
2023
that's what I'm thinking.
AAIC, Kim.
yes. My screen keeps freezing now and then. So sorry, I'm catching up.
No problem.
Well, that's great. Thank you. We're
Great.
shutting down.
Thank
All right.
you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh, wait,
Bye-bye.
I forgot. Next week we have another one. So don't forget that you need to keep the link. You'll get another link with the next announcement, which typically comes Wednesday of the week before, which would be this Wednesday. But they will send you a reminder earlier next Monday, presumably, so that you don't have to go searching for your last email that had the link in it.
Well, what's
But
the
if you
top-
just preserve the link, the same link will get you online all the time.
What's the topic, Jane?
I don't have it with me, believe it or not. Janina, do you have it with me? I have it in a stack over here somewhere, and I'm afraid to dig too far because I don't want to have it come crashing down on my dog.
No, good.
He's looking.
Next link
Bye.
is on the Tonga volcanic blast.
Oh,
With-
it's Lloyd Dangler on the big volcano.
Okay.
And
Thank
she's
you.
always wonderful. You'll enjoy it. She's wonderful presenter. We always learn a ton. So we'll look forward to seeing you.
Thanks again.
Thank you,
Thank
Janine.
you.
You saved my. I'll have to look through and find out where I made it disappear. I shouldn't show you this, but see, here's my problem.
Oh, boy.
Whoops. Oh dear. Oh dear. Now I need to shut it down, and I just went offline. Oh, there I am. Okay. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.